Your brushes are your most important tools. You are only limited by what your brush cannot do. So it's important to get yourself some good brushes. The problem is that when you walk into an art supply store to buy a brush, what you're greeted with is this daunting array of brushes of every size, type, color, description, brand, and price. I think the average artist probably just walks into an art supply store, closes their eyes, and hopes for the best when they buy a brush. You're not going to have to do that. So let's start just by naming the parts of a brush. We have a brush that has a handle, a ferrule, and bristles. The bristles are made of the root, the belly, and the tip, or sometimes called the point. We can divide brushes up into three broad classes, and that would be this, which is a man-made fiber. This is nylon. The nylon brushes are relatively inexpensive. The other extreme is the natural fiber brushes, or animal hairs. They are usually preferable to the nylon. In between is a brush which is a blend, and the advantage of the blend is that the brush manufacturer can try to make a brush that has the advantages of both without running the expense up too high. Let me see if I can give you a good look at these brushes, and you'll see what I'm talking about. The characteristic of a nylon brush, or any man-made fiber, is that they're a uniform color, uniform size, uniform shape from one end of the fiber to the other, and all the fibers are a uniform color. The characteristic of an animal hair brush is that fibers are all different colors, and even over the length of the fiber, they're different colors. Of course, you'd expect to see a lot of difference in a blended brush. You might have several different types of hairs in there. Why do we care whether a fiber is man-made or natural? Water holding capacity. Let's assume that these pencils here are nylon fibers. They are straight and they are relatively smooth on the outside. There is very little space between the fibers. A hair, an animal hair on the other hand, has a very scaly surface. It's not smooth. So it fits in like this, and as you can see, there's going to be a lot of space between the fibers for holding paint. And for us, that's a good thing because we want to minimize our trips to the palette. This is the brush we think of when we think about watercolor brushes. It's pretty standard, and it's a round brush. That's all there is to say about it. There is a second round brush, however. It's got a name. It's called a rigger. It's sometimes called a liner. It's characterized by being long and thin. This has a special purpose brush, but it's pretty important. For example, if you have two telephone poles and you want to paint a wire between them, if you run out of paint in the middle of that stroke, you got disaster because you're never going to hook up quite right with that line again. This brush has an extra long belly, which can hold a lot of paint, which can give you that long stroke. It's called a rigger because it was originally used to paint the rigging in sailboats. There is another brush that is called a flat. It is exactly what you think of it. It is flat like a house painter's brush. The flat is my workhorse. I probably do 98% of my painting with a flat. I don't have any other kinds of brushes. I don't have fan brushes or angle brushes or scallop brushes. And I admit I bought them in the beginning because I thought maybe if I had a better brush or a different brush I could get a really good painting. But it didn't work that way. All of the watercolor painters I know, the experienced ones, have these three brushes at their fingertips and use pretty much a flat most of the time. Here's three round brushes, plain old ordinary round brushes. We have Mama Bear, we have Papa Bear, we have Little Baby Bear. It just shows you the large variation in size that artists use watercolor brushes in. However, you're not going to need a big variation in size. We're actually going to talk about the size of brush you need in the paper lesson because, and this is logical, the bigger the paper, the bigger the brush you're likely to need. You're looking at a plain piece of copy paper, some thinned down watercolor paint that I'm trying to get rid of, a glass of water, and a plastic palette. Here's a brush that you may recognize. It's a Sumi brush. Usually when it's sold as a Sumi brush, it's very expensive, but if you buy it in the bargain aisle, it is the cheapest brush in the store. When you wet this brush, by the way, it's a squirrel. It's made of squirrel. When you wet it, you can coax it to a really good point. When you wet it with watercolor paint, and boy, will squirrel hold a lot of paint. You can do some really interesting stuff with it. The problem with this brush is that when you take a stroke, it holds the bend. This brush doesn't snap back, so it makes it a little more difficult to work with, but it also makes it kind of interesting to work with. Here is our nylon brush. It's a round brush. It already is pointed, and it holds a very nice point when wet. You can certainly do plenty of good things with it. Here, for example, a little house. And a door. It's a useful brush, and there is nothing wrong with it. It just doesn't hold a lot of paint. It just runs out fairly quickly. Let's proceed to my favorite brush, the flat. When we wet it, it stops being very flat, and it starts to be, it's really hard to see that. It starts to be a very narrow line. We can actually do some pretty precision painting with this brush. We can also do all sorts of interesting things with the brush. It sure looks like a leaf to me. Here's a blade of grass. I could do a ton of great stuff with this brush, and I can also do plenty of really high precision work. Perhaps you can see why I call this my workhorse, why I do almost all my painting with it, and why it can be a very remarkable tool. Here's my rigger. Let's get a little water, a little paint. Riggers, you don't want thick pasty paint in because it doesn't run out. You need reasonably wet paint. You also don't want to attack the paper immediately without running out a little bit of paint so that you just know you can get a fine line. Here's the line I promised you, the long, smooth line, and you don't run out of paint. The rigger has another use that's really cool. Let's load her up again. And let's do a little branch making. You can get, if your hand jiggles a bit, some very interesting branch work. And finally, while we're on the fine line, this is my little number 2. That's small as I need anyway. There are people that paint with a number 0 brush. It doesn't hold a lot of paint, but what it can do is give you an extremely precision line. That's all there is to say about that.